I'm excited today. This is going to be a fun video. When I started my Catalyst to EX migration series, I thought I might have time to import the virtual chassis that was going to basically be the end result of that series into Mist. It took a little while to get those videos done, and I started to wonder if I was actually going to be able to do it with the virtual chassis that I built in that series, or if I was going to have to use other hardware. Now, my demo pool folks are yelling at me to get this gear back, and I thought, you know what? Let's just get this done. Yeah, we'll run through it, maybe fewer edits, and just fewer re-records, and we'll just run through it and get it done. My intention is to get this virtual chassis configuration built into a template in Mist so that I can onboard the switch and then have Mist manage the switch. And when you do that, it takes over the config. So you do want to make sure that you have that template in place ahead of time, or it'll just blank it. We'll cover all of that. So let's just dive right into it. Before we get started, let's go through some housekeeping. Is your switch supported? You can go onto the Mist site, the Juniper site as well, and the information's there also. Just Google it and see the supported platforms and the supported code versions. I expect that we'll see a few more devices added to this list in the coming quarters as we build support for our EX chassis and start to introduce support for our QFX series as well. The EX4400 was actually added just within the last week. You can tell because it's, one, not being sold quite yet, and two, different font. As a rule, any new EX is going to show up cloud ready with the correct code on it to be onboarded into Mist. Second, are you onboarding a virtual chassis? Today we are. It's the virtual chassis that we built during the Catalyst to EX migration video series. If you are onboarding a virtual chassis, you'll want to build that virtual chassis prior to onboarding. It just saves you some headaches and some workflows. Building a virtual chassis is an operational mode task. It doesn't require any discrete configuration, although you can use request commands from operational mode to modify some of the characteristics of the virtual chassis. Usually you can just plug the cables in and the virtual chassis is built. Do that first. As you can see, today we will be onboarding a 3-member virtual chassis of EX4300 48P switches. Finally, is the security posture, i.e. the security or firewalling that you have in place in front of this switch that protects it from the big evil internet, is it going to allow the communication pathways required by the Mist Cloud to talk to the switch? Since we already did hardening on this switch, I have added some firewall elements because I have a input filter on my loopback that ends with a deny statement. I'll show you what those elements are now. Everything in the square is new. I have to allow DNS because the phone home for provisioning is based on a URL, multi-region, AWS, and Google Cloud. And then there are some specific ports. Now, if you look at the firewall rules, you'll actually see a list of port, protocol, and then URLs. And I can't define URLs on a switch for a filter. So what I have done instead is the protocol, the port, and then I'm filtering against TCP established. Now remember, with loopbacks, you only can apply input filters. And since this traffic is initiating from the switch itself, then I'm just going to allow any established TCP session on those ports back in. This may be atypical. Usually the WAN policy is enforced at the WAN edge by the firewall, but I did want to show an example of what this can look like on a switch. All right. If we've checked all those boxes, we can move on to workflow. Our first step is going to be onboarding. This is where we bring the switch into Mist, and this can be done a couple ways, and I'll cover both of those. It's also different than management. Second, we'll create a configuration template. This virtual chassis already has a config, the one that we brought over from our Catalyst switch in that video series I mentioned a second ago. We were going to adapt that configuration into the templating in the Mist platform so that when we do start to manage our switch, the configuration will stay intact. There are some post-onboarding tasks that we'll need to execute once the switch is in Mist, but before it's managed. Then we're going to enable configuration management and apply our templates. And then we'll test to verify to make sure everything's working the way we expect it to. I mentioned there's a difference between onboarding and management. When you onboard a platform into Mist, you are applying a minimal configuration so that that device will phone back to a Mist cloud resource and pull in some of the elements that Mist requires to collect information and telemetry and statistics on the device. The onboarding process does not change any of the network configuration. So you can onboard a switch that is in production without having an impact on that switch's ability to switch past process traffic. I can show this to you because in my home lab, I have two switches. One that is my home switch for all of my home stuff, and then a lab switch, which is managed by Mist. You can see here that configuration management is not enabled. I can click that button and it could be enabled. Even without having this manage the configuration, I still have access to all of the other information and insights that Mist can provide. The other switch is managed, which means that all of the network configuration is managed through the Mist portal and needs to be defined here in the configuration or by a template. There are a couple different ways that you can onboard a device, and this goes for switches and for access points. And it all starts in the inventory. Here we can see the two switches that I already have onboarded into my organization here, PDX HO for home office. There are two buttons here at the top, one for claim switches and one for adopt switches. Generally speaking, you'll use claimed for zeroized or new cloud-ready hardware. You can use claim or adopt for configured cloud-ready hardware with a Mist QR code, or you can use adopt for supported hardware that has no Mist QR code. Now, this is just kind of the rules that I follow. When you're using the claim switches button, you can put in the activation code that's printed on that little QR code. You can onboard a number of switches at the same time. Basically, this whole section here can fill up. You can generate names for them. This is for batch onboarding, or it's for just brand new devices where you don't have to worry about cutting it. It's just powering up. It can talk to the internet. I'm done here. I scan the QR code. Now the EX4300s that I have, they already have configurations on them. They do not have a QR code sticker, which means they don't have a claim code. So I'm going to be using adopt switches. When you click this button, you are given a CLI output that you can then copy and paste into your switch, which I will do now. And I will commit, and then we'll move on. Because the onboarding process doesn't take a long time, but it takes a little bit of time, and we might as well be doing something else while we wait. Boom. Magic trick. Lots of starts and stops today at the household. We're going to power through this. Got my lucky Banyan Vines hoodie on. It's time to build templates. We've got our EX onboarding in the background. A little secret, it's already done. But we're going to go ahead and just pretend that we're still waiting, and we'll move to our configuration templates. Before we get started on building our organizational template, and then after that our site template, let's talk a little bit about how Mist configures the EX switch. As you might imagine, Junos has a lot of options for configuration, and it's not practical to put all of them into the GUI. Right now, configuration elements that are available are really focused on a layer 2 access layer use case. There's layer 3 configuration here, but there aren't static routes or OSPF or anything like that, which is coming. Actually, those two examples are specifically on the way. But I don't ever reasonably expect all of the configuration elements, or maybe even half of them, to be in the GUI just because there's so many. The way we bridge that gap is through the use of CLI configuration. We combined set commands with template-based GUI commands, and together we have a complete configuration. Now, depending on the intent of the configuration that you're building, the amount of CLI commands is going to vary. It could be nothing, honestly, or if you have layer 3 requirements on your switch, there could be more. We're going to have a little of the GUI and a little of the CLI in our template, and you'll kind of see what I mean. We start with the organizational template. This is configuration elements that are going to be applied throughout the organization, or I should say be available to be applied. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be there, and you can have multiples, but think of these as the things that are common across every site that you have. We go to organization and switch templates, and I'll bring up my intent guide here. We see that we don't have any templates right now, so we'll go ahead and create one. And since this is an organizational template, we'll just call it PDX template. I don't have any radius set up. I do have NTP. I'm just going to leave that blank for now. CLI, we're going to start there because it's right here, one of the top options. And over here on the left, we can see the elements that I need to put in. The way that we do this is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to go to these parts of the configuration, use the show command, and do a pipe display set, copy and paste the output. Start with our firewall. Can't forget the interface. Virtual chassis. Oh, don't forget display set. Cool thing, side note on the virtual chassis, you don't have to have any config here. Most folks do. I covered this in the virtual chassis video. When you're building a template, you can actually have members 0 through 9. Most VCs support 10 members, some do 2, some do 4. Check documentation, but most of them support 10. 0 indexed, so it's 0 through 9. You can have 0 through 9 pre-configured. All I'm doing here with this configuration is ensuring that member 1, if it's available, is the master routing engine, and member 0 is the master, and member 1 is the backup. The default value here is 128, so all of the other line cards in this case are 128. They don't need discrete configuration. Sometimes folks like to put that in. But you could configure for 9 members if you wanted to and apply it, and it just means that if you add more members to, say, like a 3-member VC, that the configuration that applies to that member ID would become active at that time. All right, we have a lab user, show system login user lab display set. For you, this might be like a maintenance account, something that has access that is used throughout the organization, maybe for a monitoring system of some sort. They did this before with this particular bit of configuration. Copy. Get it that time? Perfect. And my system message. Okay, that is all of my organizational config. When this applies, it always applies with the rollback, and there's a commit check. And if it fails that commit check, you will get an error. It'll tell you what broke. Move on to our shared elements. Networks, these are VLANs. We'll just go through the list here and add them. CorpNet, guest, 1020, management, 1030, POS, 1040, and voice, 1050. Port profiles define the behavior of ports. We'll apply these profiles to ranges of interfaces in a later step. This is us defining the behavior that we expect on different ports. When you think about it, most organizations at the access layer can classify the port configurations in a way you get like maybe 6 or 7 total. It seems like there'd be more, but there really isn't. So we'll start with AP because it's predefined. We're going to override the defaults. We're untagged on the management interface, and it says trunk all networks. We don't want to do that because we don't want things like our POS network or our VoIP network over here. So we're just going to add in guest and CorpNet only. There we go. Everything else we can keep the same. So if I apply this AP port profile, those would be the configuration elements that would be a part of that would be assigned to that port. All right, now we need to create a few new ones. So we'll call this guest wired. And it is untagged on that VLAN and does not get VoIP. And it is an edge port. Check. Add. CorpNet wired. Access to CorpNet. VoIP. Voice VLAN is an edge port, yes. Adding in POS wired. access POS, definitely not VoIP, definitely is edge. I skipped management, probably should put that in. Enabled management gets VoIP as well. Voice, edge, check. POS wired, we already did. And we'll look at the uplink. We're just going to keep the defaults for the uplink. It's just a trunk interface. You're thinking about link aggregation. That comes when we're applying this to specific interfaces and interface ranges later. That is the extent of the config we're going to put in org. We're not going to play with any of the select switches configuration. This is where those port mappings happen, and also where you select the types of switches or the tags that you want to apply the configuration to. I'm not going to do that at an organizational level. I'm going to do it at a site level. Using it this way means that I can use the PDX template to pre-populate parts of the site template and then just build the site-specific configuration as an addition to it. We'll do that by swapping over to site. And let's check to see, do I have any notes here? Nope, I pretty much covered all that. So we'll switch to our site template. There, by going to network, switch configuration. We select the site. And right here, we can see that we have a configuration template field. I'll go ahead and select PDX template. We'll see that it is pre-populated the stuff that we just configured. It allows us to override or add anything else that we want to and layer these on. We don't need to do that in this case. We're going to go straight to select switches configuration. We're going to add a rule. These rules dictate how the switches are configured and which switches are configured. So we'll call this rule EX 4300 48P-VC. Sort of intuitive to what we're going to be using this for. I have a switch role virtual chassis that will be defined when I actually finish the onboarding process for the new switch. So that will match. I want to make sure that this is only applied to EX 4300 48Ps. Now we move to port config and we start to connect the port profiles to actual physical interfaces. We'll start with our CorpNet wired, and I can just take this bit, copy that in, and then change that profile. That's it. Wash, rinse, and repeat. Guest wired. POS wired. If you have a typo or you have overlapping ranges, it'll tell you. Also note, if you are building a VC, make sure that you have configuration elements for the other FPC members up to, and even beyond, like I said before, you can have configuration that exists for virtual chassis members that aren't present so that you can have one template for every VC. Just make sure that you're including these other FPCs here. If I just did GE0/whatever, it would just be for that first VC member. So which one are we on here? Into 40, so that's POS wired. Check. We have our AP. Check. And then the fun one, which is our uplink. So we'll paste in our uplinks. This is on an expansion card, fiber into our SRX gateway. I'll check the port aggregation box. We're using LAC-P, and this is just going to be AE0. Change this to uplink. Check. And check. And you can see that we have our site configuration, our site template now. Terrific. Go ahead and save that. Now we can get back to our switch and make sure that it is onboarded correctly. Post onboarding tasks. So let's make sure the switch now shows up. Go back to organization, go to inventory, do the thing that I do all the time, freak out and be like, oh my goodness, there's still only 2 devices here. Then realize that you're looking at access points, and then click the switch button and realize that it has in fact successfully onboarded. It's in an unassigned state right now because an org can have numerous sites, and until you tell the switch what site to be assigned to, it's just going to be here and available, but not really doing much else. If you claim a switch, you can do all of this automatically when it comes up and online, but if you're adopting, you got to do it manually. I'll just check this and I'll assign it to the PDX site. I'm not going to do the manage configuration with Mist yet either. You can do that from the switch once it's assigned to the site. So do this, and then we'll wait for it to say connected, which it says. So now we can go to switches over here on the left, and we'll give this a second, and that will turn green. So we can see that the switch has been connected. So we've assigned it to a site. We have two more things we need to do. We need to make sure that the name is correct. You can see down here that it needs its name, lab1. It'll take the host name, but you still need to add a name to it. And I'm going to give it a role. This is just metadata, but it is going to serve as a match condition for our template. And we'll save that. Nothing else is happening with this switch. We've built the template. It hasn't actually been applied yet because we haven't enabled configuration management. Now what happens when I click that button is Mist will basically blank the configuration bits that relate to the network and load the template information that I have provided. If I have any configuration that causes this switch to lose connectivity to the Mist cloud, it will not be able to complete a second commit to undo the rollback that it uses. So 10 minutes will go by and it will revert to the configuration it currently has. So we have a safeguard built in to make sure that you don't lose outright connectivity to a switch, but it is using the default rollback timer, and that is a 10-minute timer. So if you don't have the benefit of being connected to the CLI like I do, and things look like they're not working, well, you can usually tell by checking the log on Mist. You'll end up waiting 10 minutes. It will come back to life, I promise. Before we click that button, let's also talk about these lights over here. I only have a single power supply in each of these switches, so that's what these warning lights look like. This is just red because it says there's no power supply there. This one has no CPU data because it is a line card in a virtual chassis, and it would not have CPU data. We only see CPU on the active and backup control planes, which in this case are going to be FPC 0 and FPC 1. I can also click on individual switches here to get just a better high-level detail here, where I can go back to all and see the whole VC. And of course, this will populate with other members. All right, let's click the magic button. You don't just click enable. That would be a little reckless. You have to click save here and it'll give you the warning. This is the safeguard to make sure you don't accidentally commit to configuration by Mist before you're ready for it, because again, it can disconnect your switch if you're not ready. So I'll click OK here. All right, we're back. Everything went well except for this one thing I highlighted over here. And I'll show you exactly what I forgot to do. And I'll play it off by saying, oh, I'm actually kind of glad this happened. Nah, the default configuration here was literally default. And I left it like that, which meant that when I applied the configuration, the management interface that has connectivity to the internet didn't get an IP address. It wasn't set up for DHCP. Remember, this will overwrite the existing network configuration you have on the device. So I had to add that, basically change it to be management. If I had other IPs I wanted to add, I could click add and do more, but I had to change that. So I just had to unwind that. I was able to do it quickly. I can see where the rollbacks are, so it was easy enough for me to just add the one element that I knew was missing and then have Mist recommit pretty quick. I didn't make any changes. I can jump back from there. Now we can verify. If it says connected, we go to Switch Insights, we don't really see any bad messages here. Probably okay. Plug stuff into it. I was going to go through all that. I'm not. I know it works. Trust me, it does. We can go to the CLI. We check there. We can do that from my console Pi server, or we can go to the switch itself, go to Utilities, go to Testing Tools, and actually hit a shell directly from the Mist portal. Now I'm going to use my console server because the screen's a little bigger. I think it's a bit better for a video. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the configuration is done through apply groups. So if you are verifying config, use something like show interfaces, it's going to look kind of empty. So what you'll want to do is do display, inheritance. I like to add no comments just so I don't get the little pound symbols along with it. And you can see here the port ranges. 1, 2, 3. You can just sort of spot check this stuff. Maybe I wanted to do show interfaces GE and I wanted to check an interface on one of the other VC members. Display inheritance, no comments. And we can see that that is a CorpNet port. That's it. Switch is onboarded. Sorry for the wild cut. I didn't have a chance to put together a proper outro for the video last night. So here it is. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, please put them below. I'll answer them. I try to answer all of them. And I even try to answer some of them quickly. I've turned my notifications back on, so it won't be weeks, hopefully, between when these questions show up and when I answer them. I do like to try to drive my content based on input and questions from both my customers and any that happen to come up here on the channel. So if there's anything you want to see, please let me know. And when I have time, I'll put a video together. Have a great rest of your day. Hopefully this was helpful. Take care and thanks for watching.